At the federal level, it wasn't until the mid-1970s that Congress created an agency, actually a commission, explicitly charged with the responsibility of enforcing campaign finance laws, right? And the mid-1970s, right after Watergate, that's sort of when sort of the modern era of campaign finance regulation occurred. Watergate, not known to most people, was in fact, in large measure, a campaign finance scandal, because it was where all the money came from. So in reaction to that, all these laws came into place, including the creation of the Federal Election Commission. And the Federal Election Commission does a lot of things, some of it actually pretty reasonably well. And so they're in charge of collecting campaign finance information, what people contribute, how the money is spent. All of that is very nicely available and increasingly easy to find. And that's been the one arena in which the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, has actually been given some credit. The rest of what they do has been a bit more controversial. And part of it has to do with the fact of how the commission was set up and remains today. So there's 6 commissioners, and the law, as written, says no more than 3 of them can be affiliated with any single political party. So in practical terms, this has always meant there's been 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And everyone has adhered to that, and probably the most interesting example of that was when President Clinton, the Democrat, was in need to fill a vacancy, which actually runs through the Senate. But it was the missing seat was a Republican seat, and so he ended up, on the advice of the Senate, appointing someone named Brad Smith, who was and remains a very vocal critic of almost all campaign finance regulations. But that's fine. That's how the game is played, right? And so you have this partisan balance. And one of the things that happens is the process by which enforcement takes place involves multiple steps of investigation and decisions to move forward with investigations or to turn this over to the Department of Justice for prosecution. Every step of that way requires a vote by the commissioners. And that means if there's anything that's really going to, unless it's really egregious, anything that's sort of going to upset the partisan balance of the world, is just going to die at the commission level, right? And so things do get through on a routine basis, but they tend not to be very controversial. And the other thing about this due process associated with all of this is that it takes a long time, even for successful prosecution or a fine of somebody for transgressing the laws. It takes many, many years to work its way through this process. And so it's not unheard of for campaigns, whether it's parties or candidates or increasingly now third parties, PACs, whatever, to maybe slide a little bit over the edge of what's legal, and maybe getting what they want done with respect to a particular election, and pay the price with a fine many, many years later, assuming they're still in existence, right? And so, so this does not create an environment in which there's ironclad incentives to toe the line when it comes to the law. And these aspects of it, the apparent gridlock on certainly very high profile issues before the commission, and it's not just enforcement issues, it's writing regulations. So when Congress writes, it rewrote the laws with respect to campaign finance last in 2002, and before that, 1979. But as is the case with a lot of congressional legislation, it requires a lot of fleshing out. And this is something that's the responsibility is turned over to, in this case, the Federal Election Commission, to actually provide more specifics, the details of how all of this campaign finance regulation stuff is supposed to work. And what happens is when they propose changes to the regulations themselves, that also has to filter through these commission decisions. And so if there's anything controversial in the definitions or the interpretation or whatever, again, that can get hung up. So there's lots of aspects of the regulatory process, not just the enforcement, but also the writing of the rules that can get hung up in this process. And a lot of people point to a level of inactivity in terms of ultimate decisions and critique the FEC on this matter. Now, what's really, really important to understand about both the Federal Election Commission and in Texas, the Texas Ethics Commission, which is similarly charged with, among other things, managing campaign finance laws, is every member of Congress, regardless of what side of the aisle they sit on, shares one really, really important characteristic. They were all successfully elected under existing campaign finance laws, right? So what does this mean? Well, when you change things, you introduce a certain level of uncertainty in terms of the consequences. And so everyone who by definition was elected under these current rules is going to have a certain level of reluctance to encourage change, because it adds a certain level of uncertainty to the process. And so there's a very strong imperative on behalf of all incumbents, again, regardless of party, to change the laws. Because they know one thing, they can get elected under the existing laws. So, why change things? And so that adds to this. And, the FEC, Federal Election Commission, like all executive agencies, is funded by Congress. And they will keep an eye on congressional preferences when they're making their decisions. So, and I've argued this point that from that perspective, in terms of doing what it is that your paymaster wants, namely Congress, arguably the FEC is doing exactly what Congress wants. And I think the similar argument can be made in Texas.